Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this very important session titled Halfway There but Far Behind, taking stock of the 2030 agenda. My name is Ali Aslan. I'm an international TV host and journalist, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating this very timely session indeed. Because as we all know, the SDGs are at a pivotal moment. We are at the halfway point of the 2030 agenda for sustainable development and progress. And today we're going to find out from our esteemed speakers and panelists how progress is going, whether it is sufficient, whether we are meeting the marks, or whether we are quite falling behind. I'm very curious to hear from all of them, and very delighted that we have a very esteemed high-level panel. To my left, of course, he's the Minister of National Economy of Kazakhstan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Minister Alibek Kuantirov. Also extremely delighted to be joined here on the panel by the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ivana Zhivkovic. He's someone, a very familiar face in this room, I would gather, and in this country for sure. He's the ambassador of the European Union to Kazakhstan. Great to have him with us. Ambassador Yankauskas is here with us. Another person who is, I'm sure, familiar to many of you here in this room and in the country. She is the United Nations Resident Coordinator for Kazakhstan. Great to have her, Michaela Frebeck-Story. And last but certainly not least, very delighted to be joined by the head of the Eurasia Division at the OECD, William Thompson, ladies and gentlemen. Minister, let's dive right in. And in the first round, as a doctor would do, let's first get a diagnosis before we can offer solutions. And the diagnosis and the question for that, of course, is the SDGs, as I just pointed out, are at a very critical moment. We are exactly at the halfway point of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. What progress are you seeing? Are you satisfied with the progress that you're seeing at the pace that we're going, obviously from and through the lenses of your country?
That's a good question. First of all, of course, when we committed to SDG goals, we started doing it systemically in our state planning system, in the sphere of socio-economic development. So all the 17 SDGs were decomposed in our own national indicators. So partially this work has been done, so to say, in a bureaucratic way in order for us to put all the indicators in order for our local authorities and also for central government line ministries to achieve them. And in general, what we have done is we just disintegrated the 17 SDGs into 162 national indicators that could be helpful for local authorities and central government to achieve to. And we have proposed, and we did that, putting all the national indicators and SDGs themselves into the national planning system, and they are obligatory to achieve. It gave very good results. So Kazakhstan now ranks, so its position in 2022 rose by 12 points, improving from 77th to 65 compared to 2019 with a score of 71 out of 100. So this particular issue, SDGs, are given a very high praise and also attention from the head of state, from the top-level governmental level. And for example, if the Coordination Council on SDGs was at the level of Deputy Prime Minister just last year, now it has been elevated to the Prime Minister's level. So what it tells us about is that the government pays special attention to SDGs. More than that, we had the second regional SDG summit for Central Asia last year in Almaty, which was very successful at the level of prime ministers. It all showed the significance and also special attitude of prime ministers of all 5 Central Asian countries to this particular issue. And Kazakhstan is ready to share its experiences with other countries. And by the way, we also proposed to widen the summit's goal, geography, and include it some Caucasian countries, India and Pakistan as well, in order for us to host a broader and to see the broader picture regarding implementation of SDGs. And I think we are in a middle point now, so since it's 2023 this year, and so we have only 7 years left to achieve these SDGs. But of course, maybe they will not be achieved to 100%, of course. But the issue is we should maximize the effect of them, and this work will be done permanently. I should also add that even before committing to SDGs, we had very similar indicators, and Kazakhstan is one of the few countries in the world that have long-standing vision. So even in 2012, we adopted a 2050 strategy. This year, the President signed a new document, the Strategy of Carbon Neutrality by 2060, and our horizon of long-standing vision just has been widened by at least 10 years. And I think we should also reiterate our policies on green economies, on gender equality, and so on. And we pay very specific attention to all of the spheres that we have, to some of them more, some of them less. And regarding the Coordination Council, for example, the work has been done at a systematic level. We just divided it into 5 working groups. One of them is people, so the Ministry of Social Protection is responsible for that. Another is planet, so the Ministry of Environment is responsible. Prosperity, it's under the Ministry of National Economy. Partnership, it's our MFA and Peace, the Ministry of Information. So we're doing this, we put that on a systemic rail, and also we are ready, so we are always participating, we're an integral part of all the discussions regarding the SDGs, because it is intertwined with our economy, with social issues, with infrastructure, with, of course, environment. This is what we're gonna pass to our future generations, and it's a very complex issue that we cannot solve alone, but only with all the global participants.
Yes, please. Clearly, I'm hearing Kazakhstan is able and willing to play its part and contribute to fulfilling the goals that the international community has set forth. Thank you so much, Minister, for your preliminary remarks. I will, of course, revert to you during the course of the discussion, but would like to bring in Assistant Secretary General Zhivkovic here. Very good for you to be here, because you are sort of in the belly of the institution that is overseeing how and if progress is being made. What is your assessment now that we are at the halfway point? Are we making strides, or what is your assessment? Is it negative or positive?
Well, thank you very much for, can you hear me? Thank you very much for inviting me and for hosting this event. It is great to be part of Astana International Forum. Closer, okay, yeah, sure, thank you. So it is not so simple to say is it positive or is it negative. We will have to take into consideration that the implementation of the 2030 agenda has been affected first by pandemic and then by wars and conflicts, and also climate-related natural disasters, which has set back the progress and also reversed human development globally. UNDP for almost 30 years issues on annual basis human development report, and for the first time since its inception it has started to backslide in the last 2 years. So unfortunately many other elements had to be taken into consideration when assessing how much progress did we make. The SDG summit that will take place in September at the time of the United Nations General Assembly will offer an opportunity to recommit to these transformative actions. And this commitment needs to be done on behalf of governments, but it also, of course, needs to involve all of us. So in this way, we think it is important to send a message of hope and of looking at the progress of what we still can do to reach the SDGs rather than what we cannot do. So I would say it's we need to see it as a positive opportunity.
Thank you so much. I think it's always about the question whether the glass is half full or half empty in this particular regard. But the notion that you have raised and the thought that you are seeing some backsliding in the past couple of years is, of course, of concern, particularly if we take into account that there's not much time left. As the minister has pointed out, we're talking about 6-7 years here. But thank you for your initial assessment, and I will, of course, come back to you throughout the discussion. I want to turn to Ambassador Jankauskas now, who's of course the ambassador of the EU here to Kazakhstan. And Ambassador, in that regard, of course, I would like to ask you about the EU support to the green transition connectivity here in Central Asia, and of course with that the impact and importance for the SDGs.
Thank you very much. A pleasure. First of all, for me, the glass is half full. But remembering an old saying quite popular in my country, the old people especially were telling, you know, God protect us from hunger, pandemics, the wars. Actually, we got both very recently. And it's probably has impeded a little bit on the implementation for all of us around the globe. And neither EU or Kazakhstan is an exemption. At the same time, we know saying that all these shocks and the crisis is an opportunity. I think we are now in a very dynamic state of the development, both in Europe and here in Central Asia. We need to capitalize on that momentum now. It's a very rapidly, dynamically changing situation, but it's definitely upward trend that I see in the development of the bilateral relations, of the regional cooperation, which is important because we are not only speaking of Kazakhstan, we're speaking of all Central Asia. EU in this region inherently believes as we are stronger, we feel stronger at 27. Central Asia, I believe, is feeling stronger and will feel stronger. The 5 countries cooperating stronger together. EU programs in this region have always been the cooperation, the assistance development programs. Partnership was targeting all 5 and trying to enable, to boost the regional, intra-regional cooperation, being borders, being energy, being water, or the intra-regional trade. Sometimes when we set the goals which are a bit more distant, even if you look into Sustainable Development Goals 2030, it seems like, okay, now we have adopted the program, we know the end goal, we have time. No, we don't have time. I think the world is spinning now a bit faster, and if we continue on a steady and slow pace, the danger is always that the gap with the rest of the regions, of countries, of developments, which are going faster and faster, will leave us behind, and we need not to allow that. For the programs, I think we've definitely heard of the global gateways. You have heard of the Team Europe. Team Europe means that it's the European Commission institutions, it means member states, and it means international financial institutions coming together and developing projects which are sustainable and kind of well-financed, well-supported. And last but not least, probably, one thought that if we set the goals, be these goals 10 years ahead, 5 years ahead, we need to act in accordance to these goals now. We cannot build a coal-fueled power plant today if we are going on the green transition. Would not be a good thing. We need to do it now, the way we want to have the world, and that's exactly the world sustainable. We need to act today in order to be where we want to be in a longer future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We need to act today in order to reap the benefits and results in the future. Yet you say the glass is half full, something that, of course, Ms. Gjikovic also has pointed out. But you both are right, of course, that the backsliding of the last 2 years have very concrete reasons. The pandemic, first and foremost, the supply shocks that come with it. And that is, of course, something that cannot be factored in and calculated beforehand, unfortunately. But that speaks to the adaptability, of course, of the nations out there. Very pleased to hand over the word to the UN resident coordinator for Kazakhstan, Michaela Frýbek-Story. The minister, of course, has already spoken about Kazakhstan's commitment to the SDGs. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that as the UN resident coordinator here in this country who is observing the progress being made.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I would indeed. It would be my true honor. First of all, I'd actually like to take this opportunity and really thank Kazakhstan for hosting this Astana International Forum. That, to me, in itself, is showing the commitment and the political will of Kazakhstan to support the Sustainable Development Goals and a more prosperous and peaceful world. I think what I see here is this exactly political will. And in the introduction yesterday, for those of you who had the honor and opportunity to attend the plenary session, there was this sort of very beautiful video also pointing out that there's 193 countries that have signed on to the UN, to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I think this is what we see when I hear colleagues talking about how the glass is half full. Yes, it is half full. But it's not half full because of the progress we're making. It's half full because we know what we need to do. And that is to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. To complement what the minister said and just build on that, Kazakhstan has made a remarkable development journey over the past 30 years. I mean, that is not unnoticed for anyone. And I think one of the things that we see quite strongly is how Kazakhstan has engaged in what is called the voluntary national reviews, which is a voluntary review of how every country themselves are progressing on the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's really interesting here is to see which are the SDGs that people want to have more focus on. What is most important? And the last or the latest, I should say, such VNR that the government presented, ably supported by UNDP, gave that the people of Kazakhstan, their 5 top priority goals were, first of all, SDG 1, no poverty. And this is key. There's a clear message. This is what people are saying, and the government is listening. The second issue that was brought up was SDG 3, focusing on health. We had SDG 4, education, SDG 6, clean water, and SDG 8, decent work. These were the SDGs that the people, when asked, said these are the key issues we'd like to see more progress on, and these are the things that we think of. And I think what is so unique with the VNRs is that it is this tool for the government to have a very SDG-centered dialogue with the population and doing this nationwide dialogue. And from what I understand, the government is now committed to making an upcoming VNR in just another year or two as well. What we see as challenges, I think, and this is something that I think is a global issue, and that's as it relates to SDG number 12, the responsible consumption. I mean, I am shocked when I hear that these new fast fashion companies that are popping up are just taking over the world. Really? Do we all need all this much stuff? So I think that this is not purely looking at the government policies, but it's also looking at individual choices that we are making. Then, of course, in Kazakhstan, there are the dual challenge of the assets that exists in the fossil industry. And we need here to have a very strong engagement, and of course this is something that Kazakhstan leads themselves with excellent work with EU not least, as it comes to looking on greening the sector, and also of course with many of you and colleagues. So I think what is key for us here is taking this political will that we see from Kazakhstan, and we hear from Kazakhstan, and again, the AIF is one of those very clear examples. And we heard the president also has referred to a number of new multilateral initiatives supporting SDGs presented by Kazakhstan. And this is what we need. We need new ideas to implement the agenda we have already agreed upon. So let me just finalize on this point by pointing out that for the upcoming SDG summit that the Secretary General has called for in mid-September, that will be the opportunity for the world to come together and really make the choices that could result in a breakthrough or a breakdown. It's really at the tipping point if we can save the Sustainable Development Goals, if we can come up with a rescue plan. And the Secretary General has identified some key areas where he sees there needs to be significant investment and dialogue. They of course relate to the energy, biodiversity and nature, education, social protection, the digital aspects and food systems. And then he makes one point that I'd really like to echo him on here. As a cross-cutting issue comes gender equality and combating sexual and gender-based violence. And here I'd really like to note the partnership that the United Nations has with the European Union that is known as the Spotlight Initiative. It is the world's largest program, 500 million euros to combat sexual and gender-based violence. These are exactly the type of initiative we need to get men engaged, to make sure that the political will that is articulated by leaders is turned into realities for the women that fall victim of this sexual and gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kjella Friberg's story, for your emphatic words, also laying out, of course, in detail, once again, the many crucial SDGs that still have to be tackled with more intensity. You pointed out that this year is a very crucial year to define the future of the 2030 agenda, something that I'm sure we'll come back with. And since we are talking, of course, about the development and the progress, impressive progress that Kazakhstan has made, also let me take this opportunity to point out KAZAID, the Kazakhstan Agency for International Development, which has a stand actually right there in the back. So before you leave this room, do not hesitate and pass up the opportunity to get some information material. But let me turn to William Thompson now, as the head of Eurasia Division of the OECD. And in that regard, William Thompson, you've heard from your counterparts from the UN, from the EU, of course, from the minister. Where do OECD countries stand in terms of SDGs? Is that an evaluation? Is that a measurement you take?
We don't. I mean, we do a lot of taking stock of where OECD countries stand, and they stand well short of where they should be, as do most others. I mean, I have to say, it's such a bright, sunny day outside. I feel like perhaps my role here is to cast a little ray of darkness across our bright, sunny sky, because as an economist, glass half empty, glass half full, that's a boring exercise in comparative statics. What's crucial is the glass is not filling up nearly as fast as we need it to, as fast as we want it to. In some ways, I think we're rather better off than we might expect to be given the shocks of pandemic and war. Both of those have shown the resilience of our economies and our societies quite extraordinarily. So I think there's a positive story to tell about that. But that's against the backdrop of the fact that even before the pandemic and the war, we were not advancing at anything like the rates required to get there. And to think about why, I want to go back to the MDGs, which I think about a lot in this context. I mean, we forget the first decade and a half of this century, the MDGs, extreme poverty worldwide fell by over 50%. So did child mortality. So did malnutrition. The number of low-income countries in the world in 13 years dropped from 65 to 34. And some of those that graduated were small, like Mongolia, but some of those that graduated were Indonesia, China, enormous numbers of people. We overshot some really hugely important goals. We also spectacularly underperformed on some others, chiefly the environmental goals, the goals that require strong collective action. The goals we met were largely met not because of collective action or social transfers or ODA. They were met because a number of large emerging economies got their policy act together and began to grow very successfully in a rapidly globalizing world. And yet we spectacularly failed on the others. And so that brings me to my next point, which is, what do we learn from this? What's next? First of all, we do need much stronger mechanisms for collective action, both internationally and also within our countries. We've got to get really serious about things like carbon pricing to make the private sector, which needs to deliver the growth we require, also do so in a much more sustainable way. There's a lot of things for public policy to do, but everything the public power does will cost less and yield more if it is done in the context of serious carbon pricing in terms of sustainability. When it comes to growth policies, we have a particular challenge, and that is the one I just mentioned. 31 countries graduated from low to middle income. Now, I don't have time for a long lecture, maybe we come back when there's discussion, but I will tell you now, there's a good reason to believe there is some reality to the middle income trap. It is harder to graduate from middle income to high income than it is to graduate from low income to middle. The institutional and policy requirements are more demanding. The political coalitions, the upgrading coalitions required within countries are more complex. And in many ways, one of the problems is that the very policies that helped countries move from low income to middle income have created political and social and economic cleavages that get in the way of further advance. We've got to find better ways of... There's an incredible degree of consensus about what has to be done to overcome the middle income trap. That's not that difficult in principle. But constructing the kind of upgrading coalitions in countries that will deliver those investments and those policies over long periods of time is really, really difficult. So we have two big challenges here. One is around developing the kind of policies that will generate, again, the growth momentum we need, and at the same time we need the collective action steps, internationally and nationally, that will deliver much more sustainable growth, and that's probably way beyond my time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, thank you indeed for casting a realistic picture of where we are at, because at the end of the day, of course, without a necessary dose of realism, the assessment might get quite skewed. So thank you for that, Minister Kvantirov. I've seen you make diligent notes while your fellow panelists were speaking. I do want to give you the opportunity, of course, because Kazakhstan was addressed a couple of times, to respond to that. But let me also ask and follow up on something you said. You said that the president of Kazakhstan, President Tokayev, he has set a new objective to update the strategy of Kazakhstan until 2050. You've alluded to that in your preliminary remarks, and I was wondering if you could be more specific. What further and what new steps can we therefore expect from your country in the near and distant future, with regards, of course, to the obligations that your country wants to fulfill regarding the SDGs?
Well, as I said, so we are one of the few countries in the world that have long-standing vision of our development until 2050, which was adopted just 11 years ago. But of course, maybe now we should reconsider it and to make it at least until 2060. What we do is, for example, while we were drafting the strategy of carbon neutrality. We didn't do that alone, and I would like to express my gratitude to the UN, to the UNDP, to European Commission, to OECD, because we were not doing that alone. We were doing that with their active, proactive participation, and they are very, very, very deeply involved, and now we're thinking together of how to implement that strategy. So probably what we're gonna do next is we're gonna change a bit the statistics shown in the current strategies. We need to update that and also put some more ambitious goals. The President said that we, of course, should have a more sustainable, a more rapid growth in terms of GDP, because in order to get sustainable, to put on ourselves on a stable road, we must grow not only by official what we have, for example, 4%, but 5–6% at least annually. So we have an official target of 4% for this year, but for the first 4 months of this year, we already grew by 5%. So probably it will be an official target, another target that we want to beat this year. And of course, starting from next year, we, in our forecast, for 5-year forecast, we already put some more ambitious figures. So of course, we are not a planning economy, so to say. We are a market economy. And I was asked such a question whether we should plan, we put some indicators, we should put some targets, you know, and also distribute these targets among horizontally and vertically. Of course, we don't, so it's not an administrative economy. But we must have some target in order to aspire for. So the same is with SDGs. Okay, these are global aims, but we're not talking about administrative global economy, right? These are our targets, these are our aspirations, and we will change the strategy of 2050, probably it will be strategy 2060, and at the same time we're working now on changing the National Development Plan 2025, making it, extending it to 2029 with the President's 7th term. So we will do that all with, according to SDG indicators as well, because we must put forward very ambitious goals, and the more ambitious they are, the more impetus it will be give to the government and local authorities. Of course, we will not be just sitting in our offices and doing nothing. We must reach the maximum of these goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed for once again reiterating the strategy of your country moving forward. Assistant Secretary General Živković, it's already been touched upon here throughout the first round. Global disparity has truly widened. It was already at a pretty alarming rate before the pandemic. It has now, unfortunately, the gap has even widened, which of course leaves some countries unable to fulfill or finance the SDGs, and therefore the notion that we don't want to leave no one behind, the notion, of course, that is becoming more and more a distant reality. How do we bridge that gap? How do we lessen the global disparity that is making the funding and implementation of SDGs so difficult and complicated for many countries and people?
Well, difficult question, but I can just perhaps confirm that we also see a very worrying trend in inability of some of the countries to finance the progress on SDGs, despite their strong wish to do so. And on that part, it is our responsibility, us as international organizations and the donor community, but also of a wider, on a wider scale to assist in the ways we can, and also introduce new models for green financing. for example, and a lot of countries, including, or a good number of countries, including Kazakhstan, has been working hard on introducing these systems of financing for SDGs that the minister was also referring to and mentioning. As I have already mentioned before, the backsliding of human development, it is something that is unfortunately felt the most in the most vulnerable places. And here we always want to bring to the forefront the vulnerable populations, be it women, children, persons with disabilities as well. So when leaving no one behind, it is important to keep in mind that the needs of these groups are met as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. Do you want to jump in and perhaps elaborate on the notion of leaving no one behind? It's something that many Western leaders, EU leaders, don't get tired of saying, but of course it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually make it a reality.
Well, EU has an ambition to lead in terms of innovations, technologies. That costs a lot of money. Once you create something, once you have a working model, that can be used by the others. So the others do not have to spend too much time, too much money, too much effort, and they can benefit for the best that worked and not to try and fail and delay for things which not necessarily work. It's a basic idea. Now, leaving no one behind, does that mean, I mean, when I think about it, does it mean that we run at the pace of the slowest? How to avoid that? Because we don't want that. I remember reading a nice article in a book, and Bill would definitely be an expert in that, why the Soviet Union economy failed. So those of you who are over 30 or 40 in this room may have remembered that the planning economy was taking from the best, or better performing, people, resources, and putting to the worst managed and performing. And that model failed. How do you encourage the best performance, let the best win, because the best takes the others behind? It's like a peloton of the bicyclists, right? I mean, someone has to lead and the others benefit of someone leading, but not at the expense of the leader, but at the same time, sharing in a good way that the last one would not really fall behind. It's a very tricky, balanced thing, but we cannot make that mistake of either running like crazy by some and leave the others, because they're actually going to backfire. But we cannot also run at a pace of the slowest, because then we are not running at all.
Thank you so much indeed. This session, of course, Michaela Friedberg's story is called Halfway There but Far Behind, implying that clearly we are not at the pace that we ought to be. You've throughout this session, and you yourself, of course, you've already pointed out some of the reasons why that is. But what are some of the major obstacles that you're seeing out there? Why we are far behind? Why we're not on track?
Well, I think it's been stated quite a few times that we were making progress. And as you were saying, Bill, we shouldn't forget the progress that actually has been made for the first 15 years here. We shouldn't, it's not all black. There's so many people that are taken out of poverty, but there are unfortunately many that have been pushed back into poverty as a result of COVID, as a result of the war in Ukraine and the effects of the financial, the energy crisis, and the food crisis. So we need to safeguard and really cement the progress that has been made, so that not more people are sliding backwards. And that's why we need to have commitment at the upcoming SDG summit from the government leadership. And the point is that you're all looking at me thinking, really, is she talking about political commitment again? The UN will come up with a declaration? Yes, because that's how the world works. And then we are jointly going to keep the global leadership accountable to the decisions they have agreed on making. So I think what we need to see is an SDG stimulus plan that needs to come out of the SDG Summit 18-19 September. And we need to really make sure that we generate momentum at the country level, in every single country. I'm not talking about Kazakhstan, because I have to say, it is sometimes challenging to talk about SDGs after a government representative, because everything has already been said. Their political will and commitment is so strong. So that is not the issue. But I'm talking at it as a global level. And we really need to also, as you mentioned before, Abel, it's about making sure that we are looking at this. I mentioned these high impact initiatives. How do we engage the private sector in those? Because even if we're looking at a finance SDG rescue plan of $500 billion a year that will be asked for, that cannot come purely from the richer countries. It has to also be looked at from the private investment. How do we harness in this? And I think this is a challenge that we need to tackle together. We need, as has been said, to look at this to make sure that our multilateral system become more effective. And we've heard the Secretary General talking about reforming not only the UN, and we've heard dialogues here also in relation to the Security Council, and we need to also look at the international finance and systems. We need to make sure that the multilateral platforms we have today reflect the world we have today. A world where still 800 women die every day as a direct result of being pregnant or trying to give birth. A world where still almost 20% of girls are married as minors. A world where 20% of girls' school days are lost because they stay at home because they have their periods and they don't have toilets in school, or they can't afford to buy their hygiene products. These are some of the very, very concrete facts that we need to address from a policy level to make the difference for the people. Thanks.
Thank you so much for these staggering numbers, really, that you have shared with us, something that often gets overlooked by daily headlines, but very, very important that these figures, these statistics, and tragedies, really, in that sense, are being mentioned and spoken out. William Thompson, I was wondering if you could, Michaela said something about, very importantly and rightfully, of course, that partnerships with the private sector are very important to overcome the financing hurdles and gaps, the cross-collaboration. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Briefly, because I also want to come back on a couple of other things that colleagues have said. But I mean, yeah, I mean, one thing that is absolutely clear, as I said, you know, the MDGs were not delivered by ODA and social transfers and whatnot. They were delivered by very good growth policies that mobilized the private sector into addressing a lot of these things. There are multiple levels to consider here. The first and the most basic is to try and put into place policies and institutions that will simply facilitate private sector growth, particularly in countries that may be running up against the constraints of the middle income position they're in. And by the way, remember, it's harder to go from middle to high income in the 21st century than it was in the 20th. Just look at the numbers, the levels of education you require, the technological advance you require. You know, this is jumping a hurdle that gets higher as time goes on. The second, of course, is the public-private partnership and blended finance, where we need to be leveraging every dollar of public money that goes to addressing those public goods. And there's a great deal of work that my colleagues at the OECD do on this, around the SDGs generally, but particularly, some of you will have heard my colleague Mathilde Ménard from the Environment Directorate around mobilizing finance for green development and for the low-carbon transition. for net zero. So I mean, it's absolutely got to be the case that when we're thinking about this, we don't imagine we have to pile up all the public sector money. We also have to think about the policy frameworks in another sense, because I also work with Ukraine a lot, and there's all this talk about a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. I've reflected a lot on what I read about the Marshall Plan long, long ago, before most of you were born, when I was a graduate student. You know, lots of countries benefited from the Marshall Plan. Lots of countries got that money. The economic outcomes, though, were widely different because some of them put in place the policies and institutions needed to allow that external support to unlock an endogenous growth dynamic. The German Wirtschaftswunder certainly benefited from Marshall money, but it wasn't created by Marshall money. Certainly not alone. And other countries, to be quite frank, did less well because they managed that process less well. Last, I wanted to come back on what you asked the ambassador, and it's also linked to what Michaela Friedberger Story was saying about, you know, what does it mean to leave no one behind? Well, it's not about being totally egalitarian about this. I'm not. And I take what the ambassador said very well. I remember reading and writing about the collapse of the Soviet economy when it was happening. However, we are not in Western Europe, North America, going to achieve sustainable development, net zero and all of that, if we are leaving without reasonable access to electricity the 733 million people who currently lack it. If we are leaving in extreme poverty the 1.2 billion people who are there. Their goals, and whether or not those goals are achieved, will have a very direct impact on our ability to achieve our goals. We cannot comfortably sit in this world in kind of our isolated castles because these are global challenges. And the last one, and the most global one, we will not achieve these if 50% of the population of the planet is still second-class citizens where they live. So I think everything that you said about women and girls, you cited some of the most extreme and horrific examples, but we see it at every level and in every country. We're not there yet.
Thank you so much, William Thompson. We're not there yet. Yes, please. We've done 2 rounds, and maybe sort of taking stock of the 2030 agenda, getting a diagnosis of where we are and where we want to head. Perhaps in the last rounds, because we've talked about glass being half full, half empty, regardless of where you stand. But starting with you, Minister Kvantirov, you've rightfully said, of course, we have 6-7 years left to fulfill the 2030 agenda, to fulfill all SDGs. As a policymaker at the leading front, how hopeful are you? How optimistic are you that we're going to get there? We may be far behind at the moment, and for good reasons, as has been pointed out. But what in your daily work, in collaboration with your counterparts worldwide, in your daily work, what gives you hope? What gives you a sense of optimism that we'll get there eventually?
Yeah, Aslan, you mentioned it right that with the concept "leave no one behind," if the glass is fully empty or fully full or half full, so it's half of the victory is intention and is desire. I think we all have desire, so it must be, first of all, of course, strong political will, because it will be quite difficult to reach the SDGs in different terms, like, for example, going carbon neutral, especially for countries like Kazakhstan who are rich on natural reserves, and, you know, raising tariffs or changing the source of energy is quite a very sensitive issue for population, for local SMEs, and we are working on that. First, as I said, is a political will, and second, of course, it's the quality of implementation. But it's our daily work. I just want to give you several examples like that. The programs that we are implementing at the moment and that are have been done according to SDGs, but not just according, just targetedly done that. They were just, you know, they just coincide. Like, for example, we have the program of developing rural areas. There's also a system of regional standards that we adopted a couple of years ago, and every year we modernize these standards. So-called System of Regional Standards, SRS, for rural areas and also for mono-cities. The meaning of this system is to implement the minimum standards of living for all villages. There are 6.3 thousand villages in Kazakhstan, and we made 3.5 thousand of them priority villages, where 90% of all the rural population lives. It's 7 million people out of 7.7 million people. So our main goal is by 2025 to raise all the villages at least to the level of this minimal level according to this system of regional standards. What it includes? It includes gasification, infrastructure in terms of well, social objects, drugstores, for example, medical stores, medical equipment, also schools, access to water, which is also SDG, cultural objects and others. So this is a specific and a particular example of realizing the SDG goals. At the same time, we are now implementing, we're realizing the program of increasing the income of population. Unfortunately, almost everything we do, I mean, any government does in terms of increasing the purchasing power of its population, increasing the wellness of its population, it all is deflated by inflation. Though, you know, we had a record inflation last year because of different global challenges, including the COVID, started with the COVID, with the war in Ukraine, and this really hit all the effort. But at the same time, if there were no efforts, there were no work of the government or local authorities at all, the situation would have been much worse. So SME development. Our ministry is also responsible for SME development. So we see, and I personally see SMEs, especially medium business, as one of the main pillars of the economy. So medium business, small businesses, these are the main strata of forming a middle class. When we're going to have at least 50% of middle class, the economy and the political situation will be more stable, and the society will be more mature, so to say. Gender equality, women empowerment. This year I hired also an advisor on women empowerment, on women entrepreneurs. And by the way, just give you some figures. Also, this is SDG. 40% of all the new jobs created by SMEs in Kazakhstan in 2022 were created by companies owned or run by women in Kazakhstan. Yes, and I think we can share this experience with, and we are leading in these reforms in the region, and we are not going to stop at this. These are just some main figures and some main, I mean, some of the instruments that we are implementing at the moment. We have many more in different spheres, and also regarding, for example, there was a term which could be also, you know, applied to Kazakhstan. It's digital inequality. So I don't think we still have digital inequality at the moment because we're developing digitally quite fast. So this is not a problem, at least a, you know, quite a large problem for Kazakhstan because we almost solved it. But of course, there is no limit to perfection, and we're going to go with the IT development and development of other sectors, both social and non-social, in order to hit the target of reaching all the 17 SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, and thank you for sharing those impressive figures, female power and accomplishment clearly at the forefront here in Kazakhstan. The numbers speak for themselves. Thank you for that. Assistant Secretary General, I think to ask you whether you're optimistic or not, I think optimism is part of the DNA of your job description, but having reiterated numerous times here on this panel how crucial this year is to define the 2030 agenda also with the upcoming summits. Looking forward 6-7 years later, what gives you hope that we'll get there?
Well, I have already, I think, shown that I'm an optimist, and in addition to what has been said, to the political will and the recommitments from the sides of governments, I think we will need additional financing opportunities and additional donor commitments, because SDGs will not be attained without an additional investment. What I also wanted to point out is that it is also very important to monitor the progress of SDGs and also to adjust the socioeconomic policies of the governments accordingly to introduce new measures if needed. And so with the funding of the European Union, UNDP has been helping governments do that in the region of Central Asia. In addition, I also wanted to just acknowledge the importance of CAS8 in attaining SDGs as well, and through sharing experiences with the countries of the region. It is very important that emerging donors also contribute in part to the development of their neighboring countries, and I think this is a very good example where Kazakhstan is also showing responsibility for the wider region of Central Asia, and it's very well received. And we as UNDP, of course, are happy to support the activities of CAS8 to be even more relevant and even outside of the region of Central Asia. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. And another reminder to get your information leaflets right there before heading out. Ambassador, also the same question to you about in your dealings, not just in this country, but obviously also within the European Union. Are you hopeful? Are you optimistic that we will fulfill the timeline?
Well, I don't imagine how can you work if you don't believe in what you're doing. I believe in what we are doing. I do what I believe in. Yes, optimistic, hopelessly optimistic. Well, it was very well said here that the target is also moving. We said some things which we expect to be at in 15 years. They are moving. It's a moving target. It's a horizon. You come closer, it keeps moving. It's inevitable. If you are losing hope, turn back and you'll see how much you have accomplished. And that should give you strength to go the rest of the way. Like a good, I don't know, mid-distance, longer distance runners, those of you who are running or cycling or swimming, pace, leave your strength at the end, you'll need it. It's inevitable. I liked very much what Minister mentioned with this digital connectivity. We are now launching, well, launched already, we're now implementing a Team Europe initiative here in Central Asia, trying to provide digital satellite connectivity, which is a much faster, easier, cheaper way to connect the remote villages and to provide them the connectivity to the internet. And that is the basics that we all need, right? We can't live without it. Water, the same thing. Whatever we do, we need to do in a sustainable way today because we have huge plans. I just bid farewell to European Agriculture Commissioner who was here in the same room here yesterday speaking of food scarcity and the food crisis. And then we met with Minister of Agriculture of Kazakhstan, and today we met with the President, and we all agreed that there is no other country with a bigger potential for development of agriculture in the world than Kazakhstan. Good news. But the thing is, whatever is going to be done is being done right now here. Think of the sustainability and think of the water, because you cannot, I mean, our resources are not endless, and how we use them. Michaela spoke of the fashions, right? We indeed probably don't need all these things we have at home. Think about it. Think of switching the lights when you leave the room and all of that. Think the way you behave, you do things today. We launched this, speaking of the SDGs, the project that we have. We are providing here, the 5 countries, the tool to measure the results, the platform, the SDG platform, to assess, to measure, because in moving, in running, you first of all clearly need a diagnosis. I mean, an honest state of play. Where are we? What needs to be fixed? What are the good examples that others have used to get there? So this is one thing. And use the latest technology which is available today. Don't invest in the past, invest in the future, invest in the best, because this is the only way to move forward. And the SMEs were mentioned, absolutely, empowering gender, absolutely. I would add 2 very modern words, but they're meaning a lot. Is the resilience. You don't know, we don't know what challenges we'll confront tomorrow. There may be new things. We need to be ready for everything. The resilience is your ability to quickly react to whatever crisis will come along. Another word is connectivity. And we can only do so many things in cooperating together if we are connected by air, by land, by cargoes, by people to people. And last but not least, I would be a bad European if I would not say that all of that, and it's our DNA in Europe, can only be achieved if we are truly, truly harboring the very basics that enable all of that, and that is a democracy, human rights, and freedoms. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Indeed. Michaela Friberg's story, we heard the ambassador just said, we're seeing moving targets, and of course the disruptions that we've experienced in the past couple of years, also something that no one could have foreseen, but here we are. Do you think that, I know the 2030 agenda has a nice ring to it, but do you think that perhaps at some point we have to revisit the timeline, or are you still hopeful and optimistic that we will fulfill it?
We'll know after the commitments in the September summit. I think what stands out to me is that if we continue at the current pace, by 2030, 575 million people will still live in extreme poverty. And 85 million kids will not be attending school. And those that will leave school, out of those, 300 million will not be able to read. Now, what's the cost of that? So, I have messages at 3 levels. First of all, I think what we need to remain positive is that we need to make individual choices. All of us. And it doesn't matter if you know the SDGs as such by heart, don't worry, this is not going to be a quiz on those. But we need to think about our own consumptions and choices and interactions we make. Reduce, reuse, and recycle. Make sure that each and every one of us is part of making a society that is inclusive and peaceful, also in the domestic sphere. My second message is at the national level. And here I think it is fantastic when we hear from the minister on exactly these concrete plans. That's what we're looking for at the SDG summits. The concrete plans that will bring delivery to the people. But they will need investments. And that's where we take it to the multilateral level, the third level. They need engagement and commitment from not only domestic actors, but also international actors. And that is why it is so important with a platform like the Astana International Forum that allows us to come together and discuss the issues related to peace and prosperity and development as we move forward. So those three levels, the individual, the national, and the multilateral, and I'm really, really glad that we could do that here in Kazakhstan, because I think we see delivery on every one of those elements here. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, and also a very passionate plea for all of us to live more consciously about the way we produce, we consume. I think if each and every one has to play their part in order for this to make a success, it's no point in just pointing towards policymakers and saying you gotta implement this or that. At the end of the day, it's a string of 8 billion people that need to come together. William Thompson, you're going to get the final word. I know you're not going to mince words. You are a straight shooter, and looking forward to your remarks, whether the 2030 agenda can still be fulfilled.
If I look at the numbers, no. Which doesn't mean I give up. It doesn't mean I've stopped working. My teams have stopped working. I'm actually married to an optimist who worries a lot. I'm a pessimist by nature, but I don't worry very much. I just sort of get on with things more often than not. And I think that's where we are now, seriously. We will get there. I don't think we will get there in 2030, but we will get there. And I think we should not give up or let go or underestimate the importance of the commitments we've made for a couple of reasons. And I know time is short, so I'll try and combine it. First of all, in my career at the OECD, I have now worked with well over 30 governments. If you count subnational governments, even more than that. And one thing that you become aware of is that once commitments like this are made, it is very hard to resile from them. We have said collectively, as humanity, 193 countries, we need to do these things. Moreover, and this is really important, and it's one of the most important early results of the SDG process, we had to put in place systems for tracking and monitoring these things. I remember in 2017, our first assessment for OECD countries, which have the best statistical systems in the world, we had coverage of indicators for about 57% of the targets. And some of that was uneven, and 43%, we didn't have the numbers. The SDGs have made us start to understand things that we need to understand and to track and to monitor. So while I don't think we're going to get there for 2030 on those targets, we have put in place commitments and structures that we must use to keep working in that direction, because we're not running a sprint, we're running a marathon. And so I end with one of my favorite quotes. If you've heard me at enough panels, you've probably heard me say this some year previously. I haven't used it in 2023. And that's my favorite sociologist. He could almost be an economist, Max Weber. Brilliant enough that he doesn't deserve to be called a sociologist, in my view. Weber said, politics is the strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective. All historical experience confirms the truth that if humanity would not have achieved the possible if it had not from time to time reached out for what seemed impossible. We are in the business of doing that work, of boring those hard boards, and sometimes it feels like we're doing it with our fingers, frankly. But we will continue and we will do it. So maybe for the longer term I can be a bit more optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you for your final words, William Thompson. Congratulations on what sounds like a very efficient and complementary marriage. I think it seems like a match made in heaven, the both of you. Ladies and gentlemen, halfway there but far behind. I think you would agree with me that throughout the past 60, 75 minutes, this panel has given us all a very, very insightful, informative, and thought-provoking debate and great insight into the work that has been done, but more importantly, on the work that lays ahead. Minister Kvantirov, Ivana Zhivkovic, Ambassador Jankauskas, Michaela Freebeck-Story, and William Thompson, Thank you so much for this very spirited discussion. This is your applause. Thank you so much.